All right, so as you turn to Mark chapter 1, dads, I have a hypothetical for you. Just imagine that you are out driving, you've got your teenage boys loaded up in the car with you. You are headed to school like you usually do in the morning, and you come up to the stoplight, and you're sitting there at that red light, and it's a busy intersection, and some man walks up, knocks on the back window of your car, and your son rolls down that window, and the man says, "Hey, come on with me." And then your boys get out of the car. In this hypothetical, what are you doing at that moment? I mean, probably you've already locked the doors in the window. You're probably waiting for the light to turn green as you watch this person approach your vehicle. You're like, come on, green light, green light, green light, green light. Maybe you're reaching for a weapon, if you're one of those kind of dads. I heard a strong amen to my left. Now, obviously, this hypothetical, it's a bit of a setup, but I invite you to imagine it with me because it might help us read one of the Bible's most familiar stories from a largely neglected point of view, a perspective we don't hear often, but that could refresh or even unlock some of the keys to fathering in a godly way. Now, we're going to be talking about fathering and fatherhood. I know Father's Day, it's pretty typical to approach this subject. And there is a risk when talking about fatherhood that some people reflect on their own experiences of their own fathers, and it turns them off. It's painful, it's difficult, it's hard, and so it causes people to check out. It's also possible that some people feel inadequacy about their own fatherhood or the presence of a father in the home. Some dads, your kids have grown and are now out of the house, and so you feel like you've sort of passed into a different kind of season of fatherhood that's much less intense than the one that I'm in right now with toddlers. But no matter where you are, I want you to listen because I think what we hear about fathering isn't just words of wisdom from the Scripture for like current dads of children, but also there is this long thread of fathering and fatherhood through the Scripture that includes spiritual investment in those around us. And no matter what stage of life you're in, married, unmarried, whatever the case may be, we are all, in a sense, called into this role of fathering people, investing in people, and pouring our lives into theirs, which is why this intersection is so strong with our current series called Make, Discipling Rooted Renegades, right? So this whole concept of fatherhood dovetails beautifully right into it. Mark chapter 1, verse 16, passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. Now, this is a famous, famous story. Simon, who is eventually named Peter, and Andrew, James and John, they're all fishermen. They're out fishing. But they're not the only ones fishing because Jesus also is out. And for Jesus, his fishing trip on the shores of the Sea of Galilee produces quite a haul. I mean, think about Peter. He ends up being the bishop of the church in Antioch, then goes on to Rome, where he leads the church there before being martyred. Andrew, we understand from church tradition, ends up going to the Greek community. He was crucified, martyred on a cross shaped like an X. James was such a major leader in the life of the early church that Herod the king targets him to be executed with the sword in Acts chapter 12, one of the first martyrs, the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. And then, of course, John, the beloved disciple, perhaps the one who ended up being Jesus' best friend. He wrote the Gospel of John, the epistles of John. He wrote the book of Revelation. He was the only apostle not to be martyred, and he was, of course, exiled to the Isle of Patmos. And I hesitate to use the word legendary in reference to these disciples because that word legendary evokes the idea that it's fictional, just some myth or some untrue fable. But that day, this story that we just read, Jesus drafted 4 legends into the movement. I mean, he picked up 4 Hall of Famers right here. And in so many ways, the legacy of the church and that community of people who follow Jesus starts right here. But there is a 6th name in these verses that we have not yet discussed. Zebedee. What does this story mean for him? Left standing in the boat. And on this Father's Day, what might we learn about discipling rooted renegades from the man who raised 2 of the greatest? Now, I started researching Zebedee because I'd never actually heard a sermon on Zebedee before. Maybe you have, or maybe this is your first time also. So I started working on Zebedee a little bit, trying to figure out whatever I could figure out. And one of the first articles that came up was actually critical of Zebedee because he stayed in the boat. I was like, oh, come on. Dads are always getting a bad rap, right? I mean, this author of this article said, well, Zebedee should have gotten out of the boat and followed too. But if you read the text, Jesus, it says, saw the boys and called them. So part of Zebedee's role in this whole story is to remain in the boat. So what is this story really about? And there are very few details. Very, very few details. For such a huge, life-altering decision, this story does not provide a lot of the background texture that we wish were there. That being said, the main big point of these verses, and the reason that there is a paucity of detail, there's a lack of specifics, is because it's emphasizing the authority of Jesus. This is right at the beginning of Mark's gospel. A few weeks ago, we talked about how this is the launch of Jesus' strategy. He comes into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God, that the kingdom is here, calling people to repent and believe in this time. And he calls disciples because discipleship is the strategy. And undergirding that whole story of discipleship in these verses is the authority of Jesus. He doesn't have to persuade. He doesn't have to market himself. He doesn't have to cajole people into joining his team. He says, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. And they drop their nets and they follow. He says, follow me, and they follow. And so resounding out of these scriptures is an affirmation of Jesus, the one who calls decisively, with authority, and disciples respond. But there are a few other details as well. They're on a boat. They're mending nets. They leave behind their father Zebedee with the servants. And so here we are this morning, standing on the shore where fatherhood meets discipleship. And often we see it from the perspective of these young disciples. What would it mean to drop my nets and go follow Jesus? But this morning, let's step into the sandals of Zebedee. What would it be like to watch your sons step off the boat, leave behind their nets, and follow Jesus? And as I've worked on this text and let this text work on me, it's been really rich. And I would suggest to you that this story is by no means a failure on the part of Zebedee as a dad, but rather the quickness with which the boys obey. The quickness with which the boys step out of the boat shows that they know how to recognize the authority of Jesus and obey when he calls. Now that is a powerful value. That's a powerful part of a character. I mean, these boys know how to recognize the authority of Jesus and obey when he calls. Somehow, and we could consider Zebedee an important part in this, but somehow Zebedee has set up his sons to follow Jesus well. Now, as dads, moms, as parents, sometimes it's easy to be vague about what success looks like as a parent. Our culture, for example, sort of force feeds us this image of successful parenting that means our kids are well-rounded, well-educated, well-behaved, and happy all the time. And you know this is the cultural image because when our children don't demonstrate those characteristics, when they aren't well-rounded, or they display not very good education, or they're not very well-behaved, or they're showing real unhappiness, we as parents often feel a sense of like, oh, sorry, shame, let's just, come on, Because often we feel like any of that behavior reflects that we're not succeeding in the goal as parents. Our culture often will also communicate that our child's freedom is the ultimate value. They just need to be set in an environment in which they're totally free to become everything that they're wired to become. And freedom is important. Freedom is a biblical thing. God gives his children freedom, his creation, freedom. But at the same time, in the Bible, we see that people left to their own devices in freedom do not always make the right decision. In fact, often they make really, really destructive decisions, the kind of decisions that spin the whole world into sin and chaos. And so maybe freedom, well-rounded, well-educated, well-behaved, happy kids, maybe that's not the ideal. This story that we're just reading along with the rest of Scripture, it suggests maybe a different frame for us as parents. Maybe success, maybe the goal of parenting from a biblical perspective is exactly what Zebedee has accomplished, to set up our kids to follow Jesus well. Now we know in Proverbs, the very famous Proverbs 22 verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's older he will not depart from it. There's a very clear idea here that as parents, we have a responsibility to train our children in the ways of God. And even that word train means literally to dedicate, to hand them over into the ways of God. The very first bit of counsel in the book of Proverbs, which is a gold mine for parenting wisdom. If you're wondering, well, how can I grow wiser as a parent? Then maybe just read the book of Proverbs 4, 5, 6, 22 times, whatever. Or just read it once. That would be a good place to start. But here it says, the very first piece of wisdom from parents to their kids is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And when it speaks of the fear of the Lord, it's not speaking of something that you read in a book. It's talking about a living relationship with God, a living, interactive knowledge of God, the fear of the Lord. Living in the fear of the Lord is not living afraid of God. It's living aware of the presence of God. It's living in a relationship with God. That's the starting point, right, as parents are teaching their children. Ephesians 6, Paul says, children, obey your parents, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first command with a promise, so that it may go well with you. Again and again, the emphasis for parents, according to Scripture, is that we set up our kids to follow Jesus well, to live in that dynamic relationship with God. Now that Ephesians 6 verse continues and says, fathers, in verse 4, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Now, this biblical framework is important to keep in mind. Like, what's our goal as parents? We could do much worse than to hold in mind this little story of Zebedee with his sons in the boat, setting up our kids to follow Jesus well. I mean, isn't that what you want? Don't you want to have children who, when Jesus calls them, they say, yep, we're going? Don't you want to have kids that when they're aware of the invitation of God on their lives, they're going, yes, that's where we're headed. That's what I want. That's what I want for my girls. That's what I pray for my girls. I say, God, help my girls have ears that are attentive to you. Give my girls courage to follow you wherever you lead. That really is, in a way, for me, becoming a working definition for my own goal as a parent. And for me and Amy, our efforts as parents. And it's so beautiful because we have this picture. It's simple. Zebedee, the boys, the boat, the net. But I can hold that in my mind. I'm not so good at memorizing definitions, but here's what I can do. I can remember a story, and this story sticks in my mind. Lord Jesus, when are you going to call my girls to follow you? And when you do, will I have prepared them to recognize? Will they be living in a sense of identity and confidence that they're able to lay down what they know and follow you? And will I, as a parent, have the trust and restraint to let them go? Working on the third one. Feel pretty good about one. So on two. Number 3, no chance yet, but I've got a few years to get there. Apparently, that's what adolescence helps do for parents. Three things to observe about how Zebedee sets up his boys to follow Jesus well. First thing, it says that they're in their boat. They're together. Very simple. Seems obvious. But a key to parenting well, to fathering well, they're together. And one of the ways to emphasize the significance and the importance and the absolute crucial nature of time together, one of the ways to emphasize the importance of time together is by looking at the damage of absence. And there are so many statistics out there that speak to the damage and difficulty that children face when their fathers are absent. I think I have an infographic up here to show, but according to the 2017 U.S. Census, in our country right now, just shy of 20 million children are growing up without a father in the home. And that qualifies as their birth dad, a stepdad, or an adoptive dad. So no dad at home, 20 million kids. It's roughly 1 in 4 children growing up without a father in their home. And this is what the research shows. If dad is not there, you're at 4 times greater risk of poverty, 7 times more likely to become pregnant as a teen. Going down, you have twice as high a risk of infant mortality, more likely to get into substance abuse, more likely to go to prison, twice as likely to suffer childhood obesity. The list goes on and on. And when you begin to look at this research, what you find actually is that they're beginning to quantify how much it costs, how much this father absence costs our society. Now, you know you are in a hyper-capitalistic society when they have to put a price tag so that you understand the damage. But we're not people in this room who need a price tag. We can look at those stats and we can feel the grief in our hearts. Absence of fathers is a great wound. The need for fathers is in our generation perhaps greater than at any other time in American history. And not just biological fathers, but men who will step up in the lives of some of those kids. Maybe you don't have full time, maybe you can't become a foster parent, maybe you can't open your home and adopt, but maybe you have a few hours to contribute to the gaps that emerge in the lives of those who are not together with their dads. Zebedee is in the boat with his boys. Now, granted, in that time, it was much easier to be together because your sons were also like your employees. And the way that you would learn a trade would be passed from generation to generation. And so their togetherness comes naturally. For us in our fragmented American society these days, oftentimes togetherness is something you have to fight for. It's something that will come unnaturally. It won't just happen because everybody's doing all these different activities. And so you've got sports, and you've got dance, and you've got school. You got all these other commutes and work responsibilities, and all of that wars against this most simple and basic component of fathering, simply together. And so my practical advice for us as dads is, first of all, make the most of the time that you have. It's true that often our lives are significantly consumed by the responsibilities of providing for our families. But in the time that you do have with your kids, make the most of it. Be intentional, be present, listen about their days. You guys know this, but it's worth repeating. It's worth remembering. Because I know for me as a dad, especially after a long and taxing day, if there have been demands on my mind and my heart and my soul, and relationally, it's just been leading and navigating and working through this and that, and I get home and I have these excited daughters, I'm like empty, you know? I'm like, oh, I just don't want to. It's really hard, right? But when you look at Zebedee and you look at what happens in his life, he's with his boys. He's there. And maybe, right, so you make the most of the time you do have, and maybe try to figure out how to make more of the time you don't. There may be some decisions that as fathers we make in order to be together more frequently with our kids. I know one of my friends here is a pilot for Delta, and I was just talking to him about his career, and he has passed over multiple opportunities for promotion that would be higher paying because they would require him to be out of the home more nights every month than he already is. And he says, you know, my kids are growing up. They're at that prime age. And so I'm not taking the promotion because I want to be together with them. That's more valuable than whatever increase in salary I might gain by taking this next position up. Sometimes you got to figure out how to make more time when you don't have it, because it is so significant. Paul Faulkner wrote a book called Achieving Success Without Failing Your Family, which is a nice title. And in it, he talks about 30 different kind of high-achieving dads and how they managed their work demands alongside their parenting demands. And one of the stories is from a very successful insurance salesman. And so this guy is at the convention, and he's speaking, and he's stressing the importance of being a father. And it's all businessmen, it's a businessmen's convention. And in the group is his own young daughter. And so in the middle of the talk, he turns to her and he says, "Sweetheart, do you remember the time I won the $1 million round table 3 years in a row?" Do you remember that? And she said, no, Dad, I don't. And then he said, but do you remember when we used to have those Dairy Queen dates? And she said, oh, yes. And then he looked out to everyone gathered and he said, daughters don't remember when you sell $1 million worth of insurance, but they do remember your special dates. Now, Zebedee was successful. He is wealthy enough to have his own boat. He's wealthy enough to have hired servants in the boat with him during the high fishing season at least. It seems like Zebedee and his family is in business with Simon and Andrew, some of these other fishermen. Now, Simon Peter has a nice house in Capernaum that ended up being sort of the focal point of Jesus' ministry during his years in Galilee. These are not just scraping by fishermen. These are fishermen with thriving business. And we know historically in that first century, the Herod family invested heavily into the fishing industry in Galilee. In fact, they make this fish sauce out of fish guts that they would ferment and everything that was eaten all over the Roman Empire. It was like the equivalent of ketchup back then. And so there was a lot of industry running through the Galilee region. Dropping your nets to follow Jesus for these young guys was not just, I'm getting out of this hard job so I can go walk with a rabbi. It was actually setting aside a very bright and promising future. But here's the amazing thing. Zebedee, though he was leading a successful commercial enterprise, though he was leading a successful small to medium-sized business, he still figured out a way to be together with his kids. Zebedee was in the boat. Dads, are you in the boat with your kids? Maybe it's not possible from the strict perspective of your business or your job. But what does it look like for you to be in the boat with your kids? What does it look like to stay in the boat with your kids, to be together? If you're considering jumping ship for the love of Christ and the love of your children and your family, stay in the boat. That's step one. The second thing we see is that they're in the boat mending nets. So not only is Zebedee together with his boys, he's also teaching them what he knows. He's teaching them what he knows. He's not teaching them what he doesn't know, but he is teaching them what he does. Now, mending nets in the first century was a real primary task for a fisherman because the nets back then were simple. They were made of linen. That's why often they would have to fish at night because this wasn't some fancy monofilament trilene line that the fish can't see. I mean, this is like, strips of fabric, and the fish aren't stupid. So they would fish at night when the fish couldn't see. So I guess they're a little bit dumb, but still. You'd spend the night fishing, and then you come in the morning, and you'd have to look over your nets, and you have to wash them, because often they would have picked up silt and mud from the floor of the lake. And then you would see if there were any tears, and you tie stuff back together because it's not super resilient, super tough fabric. And then you'd have to lay it out to make sure it dried because it's your livelihood. Then you'd have to fold it up in preparation for the night's fishing. So this is a successful business, but it's also one that demands a lot of work. And so Zebedee, he's got his boys in the boat with him, doing the hard labor of finishing the job, of persevering. And probably at this point, these guys are in their teenage years, 15, 16 years old. And Zebedee's got them in the boat and saying, hey, we got to mend the nets. And I can only imagine that there were some days when James and John, the sons of thunder, were like, right? Might even be a little bit boring. It's unfortunate that these days there's such a lack of boredom for our kids. feels like there's this pressure, both from our kids and from our culture, that they must constantly be entertained, occupied, doing something. But again, the research on boredom is fascinating. There's a direct correlation between boredom and creativity. Learning to deal with boredom causes creativity to spike. There's a connection between boredom and reflection. When you have a few minutes and you're kind of bored, you tend to think back on your life, process it a little bit more. If you're just going from one thing to the next, you don't really reflect on your life. And there's a connection between boredom and motivation. When you really settle into being bored, and then you have an opportunity to go learn a skill or do something that would make you not bored, you're like, I would like to learn that skill. That would be fantastic. Boredom is not necessarily a bad thing, because it reminds kids they're not the center of the world. So Zebedee here, this is not a profound Bible study lesson, but Zebedee sitting with his boys mending the nets, he's training them for life, isn't he? He's teaching them what he knows. Now, I think about my dad, and I've told this story before, but my dad was a bassist for 20, 25 years. He's moved into a different field now. He works in technology, but for 25 years, he was a bassist in the Milwaukee Symphony. So he played the big double bass. He's a classical musician, professional classical musician. And that was all of his training, and music was his background and all the rest. And then he has me, this son, and I'm not into bass. I'm into baseball. And so by the time I'm 7 or 8 years old, I'm crazy for baseball. I love it. I want to play it. I want to, ride my bike down to the park and play with my friends every day. And I know this is not my dad's expertise, because he came home from the library pretty early on once he realized I was serious about this sport. And he had a stack of books like rules of baseball, coaching baseball, training baseball, how to keep score in baseball, all the different books, because he didn't know. Like, I began to press into an area with which he was not particularly familiar, nor was he trained. And yet, when I got into playing ball and really getting more serious about it, figuring out how to hone my skills, there's an interesting overlap between my dad's training and my own, because as a professional musician, he knew how to practice a simple thing over and over and over again until you perfected it. He knew how to devote yourself to excellence. And so, in a way, I was like a classically music-trained pitcher. He helped share the pedagogy of classical music with me in baseball practice. He just taught me what he knew. Dads, what do you know? Right? There's some things that you know. There's some things you've learned through the years that would be of great value to your children. And maybe at first, they're not really excited about mending nets with you in the boat. Maybe they're never super excited about mending nets with you in the boat. But there's something that happens here with Zebedee and the mending of nets, teaching his boys what he knows, that when Jesus comes along and says, hey, follow me, they say, okay, we're ready to follow. And so there are skills, there's just stuff in life, but there's also some level of spiritual content. That what we teach our children is not just skills, not just how to be better pitchers or how to mend the nets, but also our life with God. And that is something we are always teaching. That is something that we are constantly relating to our kids. And we get a sense that Zebedee did this also for the very reason that these boys, they left when Jesus called. Somehow Zebedee, beyond the simple nuts and bolts of fishing, has taught his sons to recognize God in their lives. How do we do that in our families? How do you do that? What's your strategy to help your family recognize God? And one simple thing is just gratitude. When there's something good that happens, like you bring home 2 hot pizzas, you simply say, look at how God has blessed us. The book of James says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Anytime anything good happens in your family, you just point out to your kids, look at how God has blessed us. The practice of gratitude as parents helps tune our children to recognize the goodness of God in their everyday lives. Prayer. How do you pray in your family? What does that look like? I mean, our girls are just now getting to the point where they can use words, but even so, we're thinking through how to pray when we're confused. How do we ask God when we hear an ambulance siren go by? How do we ask God to heal when we're hurt or when we're sick? Just simple stuff. We haven't gotten to any formal family devotions at this stage of life. We haven't gotten to any, formal family prayer meetings or anything like that. Maybe that'll come down the road. I don't know. Me and Amy will talk about that as it happens. But right now, how is prayer just a part of your life? And then the community of God's people, just coming to church, bringing your kids, being a part of a church community is something that helps them learn to recognize the presence of God in their lives. And showing up, simply showing up to a Bible teaching church where there are people together working toward following Jesus well is a major statement these days. One of the things I wrestle with is for parents my age and some parents younger, a little bit older, when I talk to them, I hear a common sort of thing that, man, getting up and getting to church is a lot of work. It's a big deal. There are weeks when that just doesn't happen. And I get it, and I know that in a lot of these younger families, you got mom and dad both working. A lot of times Sunday's the only day when mom and dad are both off to be all together as a family. And if you're going to get up and go to church and then grab lunch and get home and nap time, you're to like 4 o'clock in the afternoon before you actually get to be together as a family. So it is a major sacrifice. But here's the thing, if we continually prioritize other stuff over church, again and again and again, we do send a message to our kids. We don't approach going to school like it's optional. If you're paying for dance lessons, it's not optional. If you went to Dick's Sporting Goods and you bought all those football pads, you are going to practice, young man. But we were up late on Saturday. What do you think, kids? You want to go to church this morning? You know what? It's a nice day. I don't know. The more I reflect on it, the more I begin to think that part of teaching our kids what we know is teaching them the priorities that we hold. And one of the really healthy priorities through the history of the church from 2,000 years ago until now is the regular gathering with other people of faith. Because listen, the culture is against us. And it's only the first century when 1 Peter 5 says, be sober, be alert, your adversary, the devil, is like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour, right? 2,000 years later, you think it's gotten any better? No. If anything, it's worse. If anything, we're more compromised. We're more infiltrated. As soon as you bring the internet into your home, there's an avenue for that roaring lion to consume our children's innocence, to go after their identity, their morality, their destiny. The average age of exposure to pornography these days is 11 years old. That's 3rd grade, people. And we're just going to stand against all that in our little nuclear family unit? No, we need a community of folks. We need people around us who are following God with us. We need training. We need leadership. We need solidarity. We need medics when we're broken down and hurt. I mean, we need the community of God's people. And there's something about Zebedee here. You get the sense that these boys, they've grown up not just learning about how to follow God and recognize His voice in their homes, but somehow in their community as well. It remains true that the best indicator of our children's faith going forward is the faith of the parents. Number one, hands down, the faith of the parents is the number one indicator of the future of our children's faith. Not guarantee, because I know lots of godly parents whose children are on that part of the journey that doesn't look like they're walking with God. It's not a guarantee, but the best indicator, the faith of our children, is the faith of the parents. Now, the last thing, because they're together in the boat, Zebedee's teaching them what he knows. The last thing is that Zebedee turns them loose. Zebedee is not a helicopter parent, partly because they didn't even have helicopters back then. That's like a more modern invention. And this is so tough for me to imagine. You know, like I've got these girls, Bethany and Maggie, and I mean, even now, they're just so delightfully cute. And we're walking through Walmart yesterday, and people are stopping and saying, "Oh, your girls are so beautiful." And then they look at me and they're saying, "Look out, Dad, in a few years." I'm like, what is that supposed to mean? And I already sense in my heart a strong proclivity to want to keep my girls in the boat with me. And I have a feeling that the boat might be a gunship, you know? Because part of being a dad is being a protector. And then I think about some of the families here at Grace whose kids have grown. They've been raised in a place where they recognize the call of Jesus and they say yes, and they go where Jesus calls them, and now they're living on the other side of the world. And I think about that with my darling girls. I'm like, I don't know if I want that. Sure, I like going to the Muslim world. Sure, I feel called to travel to the Middle East from time to time. Not you, though. Yesterday, afternoon nap time, everybody's snoozing. I was just doing a few things around the house, and Maggie, our 1.5-year-old, wakes up, and I think she's awake, so I go get her and pick her up, but then she falls asleep on my shoulder while I'm walking her out to the living room, so I just lay down on the couch, and she's laying on my chest, and it's so sweet, and she ends up sleeping for like 45 more minutes, and I don't know, maybe you remember that, maybe some of you are in that season, but Maggie's so full of energy, so full of life, and I mean, the parenting at this stage is so constant that to have 45 minutes with my daughter, not having to like, it was 45 minutes of heaven, you know? And then, so Amy's resting a little bit, and Bethany, she wakes up, and they come out, they're sitting on the couch, they're kind of whispering, and Maggie's still asleep on my chest. And I'm like, oh, this is it. We're all hanging out in the living room. We're all in the boat together. It's amazing. And then Maggie, I feel this warm sensation just kind of. So she overflows her diaper just right on me. And you're growing up, and there's a certain stage where you're trying not to wet your pants. And you anticipate at some point later on in life, you just want to not wet your pants. But I thought I was kind of in the middle space where I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. But Maggie wet my pants. It was amazing how that happened. And yet, even so, I was like, even this is, in this moment, it's so sweet. And thinking about that little girl, someday stepping out of the boat saying, hey, Dad, I feel like Jesus is calling me here. I feel like Jesus is leading me in this direction. Oh, that's got to be the hardest part for Zebedee, right? And this really only makes sense if Jesus really is who he says he is. This only makes sense if Jesus truly is the Lord of the whole cosmos. If Jesus really is the King of all, if Jesus is the one who's calling out a spiritual family that is somehow mysteriously deeper and more eternal than our biological family. I mean, these disciples, James and John, they end up getting martyred, Well, John dies in exile. James killed early on. I mean, would you have let your boys go? Would you have turned them loose? Or would you have said, hold on a second, Jesus, could I see what kind of liability insurance you have? And what are your safety policies as you're walking around Galilee? It's amazing. Zebedee turns them loose. I mean, he's with them, he protects them, he raises them, but then when the time comes, he turns them loose. Whew. That's intense. But I think it was Max Lucado. I don't remember where I read this, but it was a strong point. He talks about how when you're walking with a young child through a parking lot that's real busy, you don't tell them all about like the traffic laws and all the different crosswalks and everything else. All you do with your kids, you say, hold my hand, hold my hand, walk with me. Very simple. Just, hey, trust me, hold my hand. And so this whole venture of parenting, I do that with my daughter, both of them, hold my hand. Sometimes we play 1, 2, 3 jump and everything else, but still, just keep it simple. Okay, this parking lot's crazy. There's cars coming from every direction. All sorts of things want to, run you over, but here, just hold my hand. Let's keep it really simple. And it struck me that in the same way that I try to really keep it simple for my girls, just hold my hand in this parking lot. I think that's what God wants us to do too. He's just saying, hey, hold my hand. Just hold my hand, follow me, trust me through this. And then at a certain point, our kids, they take the Lord's hand, and we have to trust that their trusting of the trustworthy one will be okay. And isn't it helpful to remember that the hand extended to our children from heaven bears the scar of a nail, reminding us that this one